Picture this. In the 1960s America, you could light up a cigarette on an airplane, ride in a car without a seatbelt, or even let your kids roam the neighborhood until dark. Today, some of those same choices could cost you thousands in fines, or even decades behind bars. What once felt normal, even harmless, has been transformed into criminal behavior. We'll trace that journey, starting with the minor infractions and ending with the life-ruining offenses, to reveal just how much the rules of American life have changed and why the world your grandparents lived in feels like an entirely different planet. Every family car in the 1960s, America was a death trap by today's standards, and nobody cared. Children bounced around in back seats like pinballs, mothers held babies in their laps while fathers drove, and the family dog had free run of the vehicle during highway trips. Seatbelts existed in some cars, but were considered optional equipment that most people ignored. Families piled into station wagons for cross-country vacations, with children sleeping in the back cargo area, completely unrestrained and perfectly happy. The idea that the government should mandate how people protected themselves in their own vehicles would have seemed absurd to Americans who believed personal responsibility meant making your own choices about personal safety. Car manufacturers advertised comfort and style, not safety features that would later become legally required. Chrome bumpers and tail fins mattered more than crumple zones and airbags because consumers wanted cars that looked good, not vehicles designed to protect them from their own driving mistakes. Today, this same behavior results in traffic tickets that can cost hundreds of dollars and points on your license that increase insurance rates for years. Child endangerment charges can follow parents who don't properly restrain their children, and repeated violations can lead to license suspension in states that treat seatbelt laws seriously. The transformation from personal choice to legal mandate represents a broader shift from individual responsibility to government protection that characterizes much of what changed between the 1960s America and today. Teenage smoking in 1960s. America was considered a normal part of growing up, with high school students lighting up between classes and teachers looking the other way. Cigarette machines stood in school hallways alongside soda machines, and students could buy cigarettes as easily as candy bars. Nobody questioned the wisdom of allowing children access to tobacco products because smoking was viewed as sophisticated adult behavior that teenagers naturally wanted to imitate. Parents often gave their own children cigarettes, viewing smoking as a harmless vice that was better learned at home than picked up secretly from friends. Family photographs from the era show teenagers smoking at family gatherings while adults smiled approvingly, treating tobacco use as a normal part of social interaction. Movie theaters, restaurants, and public buildings all accommodated teenage smokers because smoking was so socially acceptable that age restrictions seemed unnecessary and unenforceable. The idea that tobacco was particularly harmful to developing bodies hadn't yet penetrated public consciousness enough to create the moral panic that would later surround underage smoking. Today, selling cigarettes to minors can result in felony charges, massive fines, and permanent loss of business licenses. Parents who provide tobacco to their own children face child endangerment charges that can result in removal of children from homes and criminal records that follow them for life. The criminalization of teenage smoking reflects broader changes in how society views childhood, parental authority, and government responsibility for protecting children from their parents' poor judgment. Drunk driving in the 1960s. America was treated as a minor social embarrassment rather than a serious crime. Police officers commonly followed intoxicated drivers home to ensure they arrived safely rather than arresting them for endangering public safety. The neighborhood drunk was a familiar character who everyone knew and tolerated, not a criminal who deserved imprisonment. Business lunches routinely included multiple cocktails, followed by drives back to the office, and nobody considered this behavior dangerous or irresponsible. Friday night at the local bar meant driving home after drinking all evening, and parking lots full of cars belonging to intoxicated patrons were normal sights that generated no public concern. Police departments lacked the testing equipment and legal authority to pursue drunk driving cases aggressively, and courts treated the offense as a traffic violation comparable to speeding or running red lights. First-time offenders might receive a warning or small fine, while repeat offenders face license suspension but rarely jail time. Today, drunk driving can result in years in prison, permanent loss of driving privileges, and criminal records that destroy employment opportunities and professional licenses. Multiple DUI convictions can lead to felony charges that carry decades in prison, while drunk driving that results in injury or death can mean life sentences in states with tough vehicular homicide laws. The transformation of drunk driving from social problem to serious crime reflects changing attitudes about personal responsibility, victim rights, and the government's role in preventing behavior that endangers others. Walk into any hardware store or sporting goods shop in 1960s America with cash in your pocket, and you could walk out with a rifle, shotgun, or handgun without background checks, waiting periods, or government paperwork. Firearms were consumer products sold alongside tools and camping equipment, and purchasing them required no more documentation than buying a lawnmower. High school students routinely brought rifles to school for hunting club activities and target practice, storing them in their lockers alongside textbooks and lunch bags. Teachers supervised shooting ranges on school property, and nobody worried about students having access to firearms because guns were viewed as tools rather than weapons. Mail-order catalogs offered firearms delivered directly to homes, and children could purchase rifles and shotguns through magazine advertisements by simply sending money orders through the postal system. The idea that the government should track firearm purchases or limit access to weapons would have seemed un-American to citizens who viewed gun ownership as a fundamental right, requiring no government permission. Today, attempting to purchase firearms without federal background checks can result in felony charges that carry decades in prison. Selling guns without proper licensing can lead to federal prosecutions that destroy lives and businesses, while possessing firearms near schools can result in mandatory minimum sentences that judges cannot reduce regardless of circumstances. The criminalization of casual gun purchases reflects fundamental changes in how Americans view firearms, government authority, and the balance between individual rights and public safety. Corporal punishment in 1960s, schools was standard discipline that parents expected and supported. Teachers routinely used wooden paddles, rulers, and their hands to correct student behavior, and principals kept larger paddles for serious infractions that required more forceful correction. Students who misbehaved could expect physical punishment that parents would reinforce at home with additional consequences. Parent-teacher conferences often included discussions about how much physical discipline was appropriate for individual children, with parents encouraging teachers to use whatever force was necessary to maintain classroom order. The idea that teachers shouldn't touch students would have seemed ridiculous to adults who understood that physical discipline was essential for teaching respect and obedience. School discipline policies explicitly authorized corporal punishment and provided guidelines for its proper application, including rules about which body parts could be struck and what implements were appropriate for different ages. Teachers received training in effective punishment techniques, and administrators evaluated them partly on their ability to maintain order through appropriate use of physical force. Today, teachers who strike students face immediate termination, criminal assault charges, and permanent loss of teaching credentials that make future employment in education impossible. Even minor physical contact can result in felony convictions that carry years in prison, while patterns of physical discipline can lead to charges of systematic child abuse that result in decades behind bars. The criminalization of school corporal punishment reflects broader changes in children's rights, parental authority, and professional standards that govern how adults interact with minors in institutional settings. 18-year-olds in many parts of 1960s, America could legally drink beer and wine, and enforcement was so relaxed that younger teenagers routinely purchased alcohol without being questioned. Bartenders often served anyone who looked mature enough to handle alcohol, and fake identification was unnecessary when most establishments didn't check ages carefully. High school students frequently gathered at local bars after school and on weekends, and community adults viewed this as normal socialization that taught young people how to drink responsibly. Parents often bought alcohol for teenage parties, believing that supervised drinking was safer than allowing children to experiment with alcohol unsupervised. College campuses operated bars and served alcohol at university functions without worrying about underage drinking laws that were rarely enforced and carried minimal penalties. The drinking age varied by state and type of alcohol, creating a patchwork of laws that reflected local attitudes rather than federal mandates. Today, providing alcohol to minors can result in felony charges, massive fines, and prison sentences that destroy lives and families. Bar owners who serve underage customers face criminal prosecution, loss of liquor licenses, and civil liability that can bankrupt businesses and send owners to prison for years. The criminalization of teenage drinking reflects broader changes in how society views childhood development, risk assessment, and government responsibility for protecting young people from adult vices. Hitchhiking in the 1960s. America was a normal way to travel that people of all ages used without safety concerns. Families picked up hitchhikers as acts of neighborly kindness, and travelers counted on the generosity of strangers to reach destinations when other transportation wasn't available. College students hitchhiked across the country during summer breaks, and workers hitchhiked to jobs when cars weren't affordable. Highway patrol officers often helped stranded hitchhikers find rides rather than arresting them for illegal activity, and rest stops included designated areas where hitchhikers could safely solicit rides from passing motorists. The practice was so common and accepted that guidebooks included advice about effective hitchhiking techniques and safety precautions. Military personnel routinely hitchhiked to and from bases in uniform, and civilians considered picking up servicemen a patriotic duty that supported troops who served their country. The mutual trust between hitchhikers and drivers reflected a social cohesion that made strangers willing to help each other without expecting compensation or fearing criminal intent. Today, hitchhiking is illegal in most states and can result in substantial fines, jail time, and criminal records that affect employment and housing opportunities. Drivers who pick up hitchhikers risk liability for any crimes committed by passengers, while hitchhikers face prosecution for trespassing, solicitation, and disturbing the peace. The criminalization of hitchhiking reflects broader changes in social trust, liability concerns, and risk assessment that have made Americans afraid of strangers and suspicious of informal arrangements that once strengthened communities. Men in the 1960s, America routinely carried pocket knives, hunting knives, and firearms without permits or legal restrictions. Pocket knives were standard tools that every man carried for daily tasks, and larger knives were common accessories for outdoor activities and work that required cutting tools. Nobody questioned the right of law-abiding citizens to arm themselves for protection or utility. Farmers, ranchers, and workers in rural areas commonly carried rifles and shotguns in vehicles and on their persons while conducting business, and police officers viewed armed civilians as potential allies rather than threats to public safety. The idea that the government should license or restrict the carrying of traditional tools and weapons would have seemed tyrannical to Americans who viewed self-defense as a natural right. Business owners kept firearms in their establishments for protection, and customers who carried weapons were welcome as long as they behaved responsibly. Banks, schools, and government buildings might restrict weapons, but most private property owners assumed that armed citizens were more likely to prevent crime than cause it. Today, carrying knives or firearms without proper permits can result in felony charges that carry mandatory minimum sentences of years or decades in prison. Weapons violations often trigger federal prosecutions that result in longer sentences than many violent crimes, while repeat weapons offenses can lead to life sentences under habitual offender laws. The criminalization of casual weapons carrying reflects fundamental changes in how Americans view self-defense, government authority, and the balance between individual rights and collective security. Driving with open beer bottles or liquor containers was perfectly legal in most of 1960s America, as long as the driver wasn't obviously intoxicated. Passengers could drink freely while drivers remained sober, and even drivers could sip alcohol as long as they maintained control of their vehicles. Road trips included coolers full of beer that passengers and drivers shared openly without legal concern. Police officers who stopped vehicles for traffic violations ignored open alcohol containers unless drivers showed obvious signs of impairment that affected their driving ability. The distinction between drinking and drunk driving was clear in both law and enforcement, and authorities focused on behavior rather than possession of alcohol. Drive-in restaurants and bars served alcohol to customers in their cars, and drinking while parked was considered completely acceptable behavior that fell well within legal boundaries. The idea that possession of open alcohol containers should be criminalized regardless of impairment would have seemed absurd to Americans who distinguished between responsible and irresponsible alcohol consumption. Today, open container laws can result in immediate arrest, vehicle impoundment, and criminal charges that carry substantial fines and jail time. Multiple violations can lead to felony prosecutions under habitual offender statutes, while open containers combined with any level of alcohol in the bloodstream can result in DUI convictions that carry years in prison. The criminalization of open alcohol containers reflects broader changes in drunk driving enforcement, liability concerns, and prevention strategies that criminalize behavior that might lead to impairment rather than waiting for actual impairment to occur. Personal disputes in the 1960s America were often settled through fistfights that police officers broke up without making arrests unless serious injuries occurred. Men were expected to defend their honor through physical combat when words failed, and communities viewed fighting as natural conflict resolution that taught lessons about respect and consequences. Schoolyard fights, barroom brawls, and neighborhood disputes that escalated to violence were handled informally unless weapons were involved or participants required medical attention. Police officers often told combatants to take it outside and settle their differences like men, rather than involving the legal system in personal conflicts. Even armed confrontations between individuals were sometimes treated as private matters that didn't require criminal prosecution if both parties survived and neither pressed charges. The code of honor that governed personal disputes assumed that men should settle their own problems without running to authorities for protection from the consequences of their actions. Dueling with weapons, while technically illegal, was still occasionally practiced in remote areas and was treated more as dangerous behavior than attempted murder when both parties consented to armed combat. The romantic notion of settling disputes through formal combat retained enough cultural appeal that authorities sometimes ignored consensual violence between adults. Today, any physical altercation can result in assault charges that carry years in prison, while fighting with weapons can lead to attempted murder prosecutions that result in life sentences. Self-defense claims require meeting strict legal standards that often leave participants in mutual combat facing serious felony charges regardless of who started the confrontation. The transformation wasn't gradual evolution, but deliberate revolution that replaced a culture of self-reliance with a system of government dependency that treats citizens like children who need protection from their own poor judgment. Anyway, that's it for the video, folks. Bye.